Профессора Дейка в наших стенах. Пожалуйста.
Can you understand me in the back?
Yeah.
Okay. I will try to. Thank you, Spasibo, Andre, for being here, for inviting me. It's an honor to speak for the first time in this famous university. I am glad that I can speak about the work I've been doing the last few years and what I hope to do in the years to come. I know that I'm a disappointment as the title for Andre, who wanted me to talk about many things in cognition, and I'm going to talk about the thing which is much more general, which is not my habit. I prefer to talk about things which are more specific, like racism in the press or very specific things which have to do with discourse. But I think it was, for me, important now at this stage of where I am, and after talking on Saturday in a humanistic university here, or University of Humanities here, on discourse and knowledge, which is the topic of my last book, which I hope to finish, I hope next week or not next month, after 5 years of work on discourse and knowledge. And much of this work of the last years, which have to do with knowledge in relation to discourse, cognition in relation to discourse, is also part of this today. But today I would like to propose something much more general, which usually, as I said, I don't like because it gets very vague and superficial. But sometimes one has to stand back and reflect about the general program one has. All right? Now, if I just may recall for you, I don't assume most of you know about the development of linguistics, so I don't have to tell you that. And many of you, if not most, also know about the development of discourse analysis. But let me just, for those who don't know, in 5 minutes give you an idea how this is, you know. So you remember that in the 1960s, not only Chomsky was Chomsky in Russian was all powerful in linguistics, and then in linguistics, some of us in several countries said, in order to understand language and language use, you should not limit your theory to isolated sentences. And that is not just because everyday language comes in everyday talk and text and so, but also in order to better understand even the structure of sentences, you need many things which have to do with discourse, like, for example, co-reference, coherence, pronouns, and many other things, which you need a discourse-based theory of linguistics and not a sentence-based theory. That was what many people advocated in the 60s, developed in the 70s, and other dimensions afterwards. That was then called text or discourse grammar, and then we had many aspects of discourse, like, for example, notions of coherence, about which I will talk a little bit later as well, and many other notions of discourse which could not in principle be accounted for in traditional linguistic theories, because the notion of coherence was not even a notion known in grammar at all. So we needed new ideas and new ways of thinking about language and language use, and that was the 60s and especially the 1970s. That's the first dimension. The second development I think is important also for today, and especially when we talk about cognition, is that since the 1970s, both in cognitive psychology and in artificial intelligence, more and more we were aware of the fact that in order to understand language, language use, and especially also discourse, you need a cognitive approach as well. We have to talk in terms of mental models, in terms of genetic language, knowledge structures, and many other aspects of cognition, which are absolutely relevant, even to understand the things which before we did the more formal things, like, for example, co-reference or coherence and many other aspects of discourse. We could not really understand well within a purely linguistic theory. We knew that we also needed a more psychological theory of language use and discourse. Second phase for me important. And then also, that's also a little bit a history of my own work. At the end of the 1970s, not only I was aware more and more that we needed a much more flexible, much more multidisciplinary theory of language use and discourse on the one hand. with inspiration from psychology and cognitive psychology, and with help of artificial intelligence in the, of course, programming of many of these fundamental principles of discourse, there was something fundamentally missing, namely the third dimension, which is the social dimension of discourse. So when I started to work in the beginning of the 1980s on things like racism, the question was, how do I relate these kind of things with language? I mean, how can you account for power and power differences in society, domination, inequality, racism, sexism, and other forms of social inequality in terms of language and language use? I mean, obviously these things have to be related, and later we will talk about it a little bit more. And I wanted to establish a systematic relationship between, on the one hand, discourse and discourse structures, and on the other hand, cognitive structures, and finally, social structures. Now, this has been for a long time the development in my own work, and also in the work of some people. What I would like to do today is, on the one hand, summarize the main properties of this interdisciplinary framework, and also show what is still missing and things which we still have to work out, and then afterwards we have a debate with questions and critique and where to go from here. So I think now 2013 is a good time to look back on what we have done the last 50 years. Discourse analysis now exists half a century, as you well know, beginning in mostly anthropology with the work of Delheims on communicative events in the 1960s, 62, 63, 64, and between 64 and 74, these 10 years were the formation years of most movements and directions in discourse analysis. That was when anthropology introduced the ethnography of speaking of Delheims and many others. That is when in Germany and other countries text grammar became to be formulated. That was when sociolinguistics started to work also on everyday discourse and all kinds of other, in the work of Bill above. That is also the beginning of psycholinguistics. Between 64 and 74 is absolutely crucial. It was also the beginning of the cognitive psychology of discourse comprehension in the work of Walter Kinch, with whom I later worked on a book we did together. His first book is 74, my dissertation on text grammar 72. The first books of, for example, in sociolinguistics of Bill above, you know, language in the city and so on, also 72. It's amazing to see how independently each of each other is sort of invented more or less the same break with sentence grammar, formal Chomskyan sentence grammars. So all of us, so the same with pragmatics, also studied in the same thing. So interesting is that somehow we had developments independently in many disciplines, also in semiotics in France, after structuralism. So in the study of language and communication and discourse, we had parallel developments, all started more or less in between 64 and 74. That's very interesting. Now, where are we today? I mean, looking back on now exactly half a century of work in discourse analysis. What I would like to propose today is to get more integration. So we have not here conversation analysis and here text grammar and a little bit of cognitive analysis there. We need a coherent, multidisciplinary theory of how discourse somehow is related to both cognition and society. All right, so that's why the title I announced for today is both a summary of what I think I have done with many other people, and at the same time it's a good program to go ahead. All right, that's the idea. And it should be somehow an integrated program for students, for professors, for people in different disciplines to also work together. There are many gaps in the theory which we should be filled, and I think we can fill them in a coherent way. Now, so my proposal is to have this theory of discourse, this multidisciplinary new theory of discourse, should have three fundamental dimensions I already mentioned. First of all, of course, the structures of discourse itself. At all levels and all dimensions, and also they should also be integrated. So they and I will talk about them a little bit later. So the first dimension is, of course, a central task for linguistics and discourse analysis, that you are able to describe discourse structures at all levels of analysis, and not just syntax or not just morphology, but everything. So that's the first task, and I'll talk about it a little bit later. The second major task is to show that somehow these different discourse structures are related also to underlying various types of underlying cognitive structures, mental representations, and below that, of course, also neuropsychological structures, about which I won't talk about today. That's a different kind of dimension, but it is part of this cognitive approach to language and discourse and communication. So we also need a cognitive dimension, not just because it's relevant for psychologists. It is relevant for us also in discourse analysis and linguistics. You won't be able to understand many aspects of discourse which we think are important for us without a proper cognitive analysis. All right, that's the second thing. And even when people in psycholinguistics we would be happy with this kind of program, they forgot that also there is a very fundamental cognitive, social dimension. So language, of course, as we all know from many studies in sociolinguistics, many studies in conversation analysis, also in the last 40, 50 years, fundamentally language is also interaction. Not again because we happen to do interaction in everyday conversation, but also in order to fundamentally understand both the linguistic, discursive, and the cognitive aspects of discourse, you also need fundamentally an interactive dimension. Actually, I was now reading on the plane first chapter of a book on the interaction instinct, of someone, and shows again that for many reasons, also of a human evolution, we should fundamentally, of course, see language within an interaction perspective, which of course is perfectly compatible with people working in conversation analysis and interaction, although they don't look at these notions and usually don't talk about cognition. So what happens is, and that's why I'm doing this kind of plea today with you here, even when it's very general, is don't forget fundamental aspects of the theory. So don't forget the social aspect, and don't forget the cognitive aspect, and obviously don't forget the discourse aspect. And many of the people, for example, in artificial intelligence, would be very happy to program discourse, understanding of production, and so on, and maybe also some cognition, but forget that language also has to do with interaction and even has to do with power and many other social things which are also relevant. So that is the general idea. Now let me just specify this and give you some examples of this. Of course, the topic is a topic for 1,000 hours of lectures. And we only have an hour, actually we have only 50 minutes now. So let's just talk about these fundamental things. The kind of thing I will do, I will also illustrate with one example. An example I know well, and some of you may have read about, namely how racism is produced and reproduced in society through discourse. I mean, I've worked on this since the early 1980s, and it's a very good example how you need all these three dimensions of language use and discourse, namely discourse structures, cognitive structures, and social structures. All right, these three dimensions. And what I do is sometimes place within the broader framework of critical discourse analysis, and I would like just to remind you that critical discourse analysis is not a method of discourse analysis. I tell you that because the authors who send me papers for the journals very often say, I am going to apply critical discourse analysis. You cannot apply critical discourse analysis because it's not a method. It's not a theory. It's a spirit. It's a perspective. It is a critical attitude you have about social inequality, and you can use any method. In the social sciences and the humanities and linguistics, critical discourse analysis has many methods, mostly qualitative, but also quantitative, also ethnography, also participant observation. All the methods of the social sciences are used in critical discourse analysis. It simply has to do that you focus on questions of power abuse, and domination in society, and study that from the perspective of linguistics and discourse analysis. That's the idea. but it's not a method you apply. But I work in this area since the 1980s when I worked on racism and discourse, and I will give that as an example to illustrate the theory of today. Now, first of all, this dimension most of you know already, so I will be very quick about that. First, the dimension of discourse structure itself. Now we have, of course, a discourse structure is not just a sequence of sentences, but the very special sequences of sentences or turns in conversations, and there must be something extra beyond simply the fact that you have sequences of sentences, and in the same way as sequences of words don't make grammatical sentences, in the same way sequences of sentences don't make acceptable, or grammatical is a strange word for discourse, but somehow don't make acceptable discourses. So something else we need. So I won't talk now today much about the morphology or the phonology of discourse, which is there today too, but in order to understand intonation, if only in, for example, the formulation of topic and focus, you also need stress and you also need parts which are emphasized, and that just not just depends on the social context, but also depends on the discourse context of text. So intonation and syntax and morphology, they also depend on discourse structure. I won't talk about this because you know that already. So the second thing, so let me forget for a moment, although very important, the syntax and morphology and phonology. Let's begin with the semantics. All right, now, the first thing you know about discourse, and I already mentioned this, that it is not a discourse or a conversation is not an arbitrary sequence of proposition or sentences. It is something which somehow is coherent. Now, we all know that, but now how do you define this kind of coherence? So, if you just remember, coherence, you might say, if we have some kind of semantics of sentences in terms of propositions, then coherence may be something like you have meaning relationships between sentences in discourse. You know, people say, okay, something like you may have as a semantic primitive that you have, for example, human, and then somehow this primitive is maintained as part of the meaning of the sentence of discourse. Now that is what we learned in the 60s in structural semantics. I learned that in Paris when I was a student, well, a visitor of the seminars of Cremas and structural semantics many years ago, and it was all fine and nice, this kind of structural semantics, only it was wrong. It was wrong because somehow discourse coherence is not mainly at the basis of meaning, but is mainly based on reference. It is not, sentences do not cohere because they have meaning in common. Sentences cohere because somehow they are about things in the world which are related. For example, cause and consequence, causes and consequences. The fact that, for example, the same person is still there in some kind of situation. So you have a story about Mary, and Mary is still there in the next sentence, and you keep talking about Mary, and maybe people she is meeting or talking to, and so on and so. Somehow, it's not about meaning of Mary or being a woman or not. What you talk about is the same person in some kind of situation, or some object in the situation, or some time in the situation. So suddenly you are not talking about coherence in terms of meaning, but in terms of properties of some kind of situation in the world you talk about. Coherence has to do with the kinds of situation you talk about. For example, time, place, participants, relationships between events, and so on. Now we come very much closer to what we also are interested in cognitive psychology. One of the things, for example, and now, is that in cognitive psychology today, people are interested also very much in what is the basic structure of situations. What is the basic structure of an event? And how do people process an event? So anytime you wake up in the morning, you take a shower, you get out, you take breakfast, whatever. These are all events. But there are some kind of continuous sequence of events in your life. All right? But you can still say, yes, this morning I had breakfast, yes, I took a shower, yes. So somehow this continuous sequence of everyday experience is segmented in different kind of units. which you can call events or actions and so on. So that people at this moment in cognitive psychology and also in computer science and artificial intelligence who are analyzing the cognitive structure of events, how you can distinguish one from the other. So for example, if you show people a movie and you ask, why don't you split up the movie in separate events? The idea then is, if people are able to do so more or less coherently, so you split it up in the same way as she does, somehow there must be something in the stream of happenings which are able to distinguish one event from another, where one begins and the other ends. So this is already nice, and it makes that, okay, if the coherence of discourse is based on the way people understand events, then what we now can learn from the cognitive psychology of events somehow may be at the basis of what we traditionally call the coherence of discourse. So this is one of the many ways I'm going to show that we need all these levels at the same time. All right, so that the cognitive basis of the understanding of events is at the basis of coherence of discourse. Okay, now that's the first thing. And I will later talk in terms of mental models when I talk about these particular kind of representations in our mind of the events people talk about in discourse. Everyday conversations, news, and so on. In principle, many of the kinds of discourse we talk about in everyday life are based on events and actions, like stories, news in the press, and so on. And later we will talk about these events in terms of their mental representation, in terms of mental models. All right? Now so we will then say, but later we will elaborate that a little bit more, something very simple, that a discourse is coherent when the participants of the discourse are able to construe a mental model for that discourse. All right, so it's not an analysis of meaning, it's not something which has to do with semantic analysis, it has to do with the way people represent events the discourse is about. So it's more referential. Referential is the best term. There is something else. We also know that discourse not only has a sequential or linear relationship from one sentence to the next, which you could call linear coherence, or from one meaning of a sentence, let's say from one proposition to the next. We also know since many years, and André told me that he taught his students about macrostructure even, so we also know that since many years that discourses also have a more global organization, not just locally, not just micro, but also macro. So people have an idea that the discourse not only has meaning locally, but also a global meaning, which you all know in terms of macrostructure, or in terms of global topics, or in terms of, it is something global, not local. And how do we see these things in discourse? Well, we see them in titles, we see them in summaries, we see them in leads in newspaper articles, we see them in conclusions and so on. So discourse not only has a local structure from one sentence to the next, but also a global one. You can simply say, oh, the talk was about that. For example, you can say later, Teun van Dijk presented a general talk about the relationship between discourse, cognition, and society, and you would have the macrostructure of what I said. All right? So it will be a summary. It could be a title. That's also how I announce it. So that's the macro level, now, which is semantics. It's semantics, that's it. But it's not only semantics. Because in order to produce, in order to understand this macrostructure, many of these macrostructures you cannot even see in discourse. Discourse is not only locally coherent, but also globally coherent, and people not always express this. You may have a conversation, and people will not have, most everyday conversations don't have titles. People don't always conclude, but it may still be globally coherent about the story people tell, and it does have some kind of macrostructure, but it's not always expressed in text and talk. It is sometimes, very often, implicit. So the question then is, if it has a macrostructure, where is it? Where is it? We all know that it's there because that's how we memorize it. We also know from psychology that what people memorize best is precisely the global structure. After reading the text in the newspaper, you don't remember the details after a day, but you can still say, yes, I read this story about, for example, this morning when I read it in the paper on a terrorist attack in Boston. You will say, yes, I read that story. Do you remember the details? No. But you do remember that there was an attack in Boston. That was the macro structure of the news story this morning. All right, so somehow it's there, but it's not visible. So somehow it must be read. And again, the same conclusion is, if it's not in the text, it's in the head. It's very simple. If it's not in the text, it's in there. So it's part, again, of the way people represent texts in the same way, as I said. In order to understand local coherence, sequential coherence, from event to event, you need a theory of events from psychology. For example, in terms of mental models, we are now going to say these macrostructures somehow also have to do with probably the organization of these mental models in memory. Namely, that they are not just local, sequential, but also global and hierarchical. You have global hierarchical structure, like a pyramid. All right, so that's one. So what I'm showing again is that somehow systematically at all levels of discourse you always need, again, a cognitive dimension in order to really explain what's going on, also at the linguistic side. I gave you an example which is a summary of what I told in the other university on Saturday, namely the manifestation of knowledge in discourse. So the analysis of an epistemic analysis of discourse is interested in the way how knowledge is managed by speakers in discourse. We all know that in order to communicate you need lots of knowledge. Again, this is psychological notion we're going to talk about a little bit later. So discourse you can only understand and produce when people have lots of knowledge about the world. I will come back to that a little bit later. But even from a linguistic point of view, we know that there are many people in the old days did not talk about knowledge, but more about information structure. You know, structuralism already, or functionalism in Czechoslovakia and many other countries, talk in terms of topic and focus and many other things, evidentials, modalities. So there are many structures of discourse and language which somehow have to do with information, with what is old or given or no longer relevant information or knowledge, and something which is somehow introduced as new or emphasized as new, or something somehow people didn't know yet. So the classical distinction between topic and focus and sentences, and then also at the level of the whole text, has to do with the way we somehow sequentially express discourse in discourse. Knowledge and discourse. So the fundamental idea is that somehow there is a system which shows that people, in order to inform other people, presuppose that you know something, and that part is the topic part of the sentence, or the presuppositions of the sentence, another notion which has to do with knowledge and discourse. And that particular kind of management of discourse, this kind of epistemic management of discourse, shows up everywhere. Why? Because, again, one of the fundamental functions of language is to inform people about something new. And the second fundamental notion is not only that you inform something new, but also that you relate it with people already know. So the two fundamental functions of language, to communicate something new and to show through discourse and sentence structures how it is related